Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, dear friends. It's a pleasure to be able to address you in this wonderful conference, which continues the theme of last year, that of healing. When I was deliberating about a topic that I wanted to speak about today, or what I should be speaking about, or what I'd be kind of compelled to speak about, it occurred to me that, the whole question of healing really depends on a few factors. Number one, what is to be healed? Everybody talks about the healing of the human self, but we have very different conceptions right off the bat of what it means to be a person, of what it means to be a human being, of what it means to live a meaningful life as a human being, based on a certain definition of what being human is. So, of course, with the great resources that we have in the Sufi tradition, none of these are actually problems for us. And so it makes our job a whole lot easier when we deal with the question of healing because we've already got a very robust and clear understanding of what a person is all about, what image they're created in, namely the divine image, of course, in the image of the All Merciful. And at the same time, what a life in meaningful interaction with God entails vis-a-vis the divine and the human. So how we respond to the divine largely has to do with how we understand ourselves. And the image that we have of ourselves will also largely color our interaction with God and God's creatures. And of course, with ourselves. So the question is really, when it comes to the need for that self that has been created in the image of God but fallen away from heaven, being trapped in this world and kind of perhaps even just lost sight a little bit of that original home and become forgetful of its true origins. That particular self, when it finds itself in that fallen situation, this is what we will refer to as the state of becoming aware of one's ailment or of one's illness. Now, of course, there are many wonderful texts in the Islamic tradition that explain specifically this relationship between the self and the divine and the awakening of the self to its fallen situation vis-a-vis the divine and its fallen situation therefore with itself. And the texts that we think about in this regard, for example, like Maulana's poetry or Sohrawardi's beautiful Persian treatises, his visionary recitals, they all have a theme that runs throughout them, namely the need to recover the notion of what that self actually is. So they're all, in a sense, texts that deal with healing. And when we look at it from these perspectives, of course, the Sufi tradition has so much to offer the world when it comes to the question of healing. Now, when I thought about further what kind of materials that we could share with you in this brief lecture that we're giving, for this conference, one of the things that occurred to me would be to, keep it simple and just focus on a wide range of different texts in the tradition that speak about this recovery of self. Yeah, the difficulty that raises, of course, is that each of these texts deal with the nature of the recovery so differently. Think of the Mantiquater of Attar, for example, in such a complex and yet a straightforward narrative at the same time, detailed but straightforward, but overall quite complex structure, dealing with the levels of the recovery of the self. That's one way to do it. Yet I think this would take us too far adrift if we go in that direction or bring in the writings of Ibn Arabi, for example, or one of my personal favorites, of course, Ain al-Quzat. There are different ways that we could frame that relationship. What I thought I'd do is focus on that one thing that creates the greatest barrier between the recovery of the self and therefore the discovery of the self and the intimacy with God. So the one quality, the one vice, if you like, the negative quality that really impedes the soul's relationship with God on every level. And then again, it ties into every other dimension of human existence as well. And that is the quality of, or the negative quality of pride. Now, again, we don't need to spend too much time discussing what pride is, because I think most people, at least, on one level, understand that pride it's a negative thing. even people who may not necessarily believe in God or religion, they don't like to see people act arrogantly. It's kind of looked down upon largely in many cultures, most cultures, probably every culture. And when you see kind of proud behavior, especially towards another human being, one person acting proudly to somebody else, the onlookers might even wonder what's going on here. This is not something seems very inherently wrong about that. So if we deal with pride, of course, we have to deal with its exact opposite, which is humility. And when you look at those pairings together, pride being the thing that takes you away from God, from your true self, and humility, the opposite, so that the thing that brings you back to your true self, brings you in a more intimate relationship with God, you will see that pride in this conception, it's considered a great disease or an illness, as Imam al-Ghazali, one of the great theorists, of course, who deals with pride and humility, explains so well that pride, it's really it's an afa, they call it in Arabic. The term is an afa, or a defect, and it's a terrible defect, and it's the one of the things that not only is it not loved by God. After all, Allah Ta'ala says in the Quran, إِنَّهُ لَا يُحِبُّ الْمُسْتَكْبِرِينَ. He does not love the proud. Anytime the Quran says, or Allah Ta'ala tells us that He does not love something, you have to pay very close attention to that. Because if that means that He never will love that thing. Right? And the opposite, if He says He loves something, pay attention to that, because that's the surest way to enter into the divine presence, to do the things that He loves. The surest way to distance yourself from God and from your true nature is to do the things that God does not love. So pride, in that sense, not only is it such a great ailment for the human being, spiritually speaking, it also is a great ailment for society at large. And we'll see examples of that later on, inshallah, in this lecture. When we get to the opposite of pride, that of humility, you see that in the spiritual life, again, across the board, in every religious tradition you can think of, humility, it's always exalted, it's extolled, it's considered to be the greatest quality for the spiritual aspirant. And Imam al-Ghazali tells us that much in his book on the condemnation of pride and self-admiration. He tells us that he calls it Ras akhlaq al-muttaqin. It's the most important of all of the quality traits of the people who have reverence for God. Humility, it's the highest of them. And then, of course, just look at all of the examples from the blessed Prophet himself, والسلام, how he emphasizes humility on every dimension, in every dimension of his life, to the point that he could have even have lived like a king if he wanted to, but he always chose the way of humility inwardly and outwardly, in terms of the outward trappings. He could also have had anything that he wanted, but he would always choose faqr, both inwardly and outwardly. Remember his famous saying, faqri fakhri, right? My poverty is my pride. That kind of poverty, that realized spiritual poverty, is the essence of what humility really is all about, to become actualized in one's own self and negation, and to become totally realized in the divine image. You have to let go entirely of this false sense of what yourself actually is telling you are. Once you distance yourself from that, then all that is left is nothing. It's pure poverty, in other words, nothingness. And that's exactly where the servant has their complete realization. And the Prophet ﷺ was the greatest example of that, somebody who was completely submitted to the divine will, and God, through whom, acted as he acted, as you all know. وَمَا رَمَيْتَ إِذَا رَمَيْتَ وَلَكِنَّ اللَّهَ رَمَى. You did not throw when you threw, but rather it was God who threw. The Prophet ﷺ, of course, is the fundamental model of humility for Sufis, for Muslims in general. And we're going to be looking at some of his sayings today, where he deals and explains what humility is really all about, how to attain it, and so on and so forth. Now, that book that I was mentioning by Al-Ghazali, it's this text here. It's been translated into English. There it is. It's called The Condemnation of Pride and Self-Admiration, Kitab Dhamm al-Kibri wal-Ujub. It's book 29 of the Ihya of Imam al-Ghazali, and many have considered it to be the most important of the books, of the 40 books of the Ihya, because again, it deals with that, the fundamental vice of pride, and then, as Imam al-Ghazali said, the chief virtue, namely that of humility. If you look very carefully at all of the virtues in the spiritual life, one of the great benefits of humility in particular is that once that virtue is realized, the other virtues come very easily. And so humility as the basis of the virtues, it makes, if one cultivates true humility, then all the rest of the virtues kind of fall into place. Sometimes it's not hard, not easy to see the connection. For example, what's the difference? What's the distinction between humility and love in terms of which one comes first, which one's more superior? I'm not going to get into those debates here, of course. But if you look at somebody who's become realized in humility, right, there is no self for him to love. So that love, which is a natural part of what we are, it always radiates outward towards others. And because there's no distinction between self and other, it's also like a self-love at the deepest level that you're having. So that's because you love the divine self inside of you. And so that self-love becomes a love for the other. That can only happen when there's actually no nafs, no ego left. Khwaja Khord, the very famous Indian Sufi master, he once explained what fana is and what baqa is. He said, fana is when you go, and baqa is when he comes. So that's what the goal of the spiritual life really is all about. That's the nature of where all the healing will take place. You yourself need to disappear. Your own ego has to go, in other words. When that happens, God takes over. Insofar as you claim some kind of agency for yourself, some kind of ability to forge your own way, and you don't let the captain of the ship steer the course for you, that's where all the problems come up. Every self-contrivance that a person has, every time they do what is called tadbir, right? Trying to govern their own affairs, micromanage things, that's where all of the difficulties in our lives come up. Whereas if we just let God do his thing, as they say, let him do it the way he wants to do it, you'll see that everything happens beautifully, smoothly, in a wonderful way. And that requires a lot of humility on your part with respect to God, to understand that you're nothing, to understand that you don't have control, to understand that God is in complete control. And that's largely the message of the Quran too, right? You want greatness, right? Man kana yuridu al-izzata falillahi al-izzatu jami'a. Right? Whoever wants greatness, all of the greatness is with God. That's where all of it comes from. He endows you with all of these gifts. He lets you use them, and then he rewards you for them. Where's your agency in that? Even in the very fact that the things that you do have, and the blessings that you do have, and the things that you can, act with to obtain other benefits in the world and help other people, all of those are gifts too. I always laugh when my birthday comes around, because my youngest child, she what she'll do is she'll go into my office, and she'll pick out some of the things that are on my desk, things that belong to me, my misbaha, maybe a little book, something like that, maybe my hat. She puts them into a little package and then gives them to me on my birthday, and says, "Oh, look what I have for you." And I open it up and I always laugh. This happens every year, and it makes me very happy to see that, because of course it reminds me. It's such a reminder to me, of the way we interact with God, because all of the things that we can so-called give to God, they already belong to him to begin with. There's nothing that we give to him that's going to impress him, in other words, right? It's not ours to begin with. So just like my daughter takes the stuff that belongs to me and she brings it to me, and right, and then I obviously I marvel at that. It's analogous to our relationship with God, where we have all of these blessings that he's already given to us. They're his to begin with. All we need to do is package them properly and make sure the original items don't get destroyed, and return them back to their owner. To the extent that we can do that has a lot to do with the degree to which we can be humble in our lives. Now, I should also take the occasion to note the utter difference in this case, and in so many other cases, between Islamic ethics and, let's say, ethical traditions that people like to compare Islam to. For example, the Greek. In Greek ethics, traditional Greek ethics, humility was not considered like a virtue, right? It's considered because you're down, right? When you're being humble, you're down. So Aristotle, for example, would say that that's not a positive position for a human being to be in. And so, the contention goes, and of course, I'm a great supporter of this view, that really we got to look at ethical traditions in their own terms, not vis-a-vis some other tradition. Got to find out what's important in the tradition that we're looking at, what their terms are, how they conceive of them, of what a self is, and how they understand that the virtue in question or the vice in question. Nothing could be further from the way the Sufis look at things, and especially, Islam in general as well, right? That humility is never considered to be a bad thing. It's like Imam Ghazali said, as I mentioned, it's the greatest thing that you can do for yourself is to be humble and to be lowly before God. Now, there are some distinctions that we'll bring up later about when humility is a good thing and when it's considered not positive, because there are times definitely when people put on airs of being humble and it's not actually humility, or they think they're being humble and they're actually just making fools of themselves. So we have to deal with those systematically. For a good part of what I'm going to say for the rest of this lecture, I'll be drawing on this aforementioned book by Imam al-Ghazali, which I would highly recommend anyone to read if they have not already. It exists in English translation, and hopefully one day it can also come out in Turkish. I'm sure the Ihya exists in the Turkish language. So if you have it or access to it already, by all means, do get it. This very translation itself might come out in Turkish one day. So that would make me very happy, because the notes in there, especially, they point you to all kinds of different leads. Of course, Imam al-Ghazali, he's writing rather late in the tradition in terms of the fact that there were already so many Sufi texts before him, so many Sufi figures who addressed the question of humility and pride, and how could they not, right? It's so fundamental to the Quran, it's so fundamental to the Hadith. But what makes Imam al-Ghazali's treatment of pride so important is that he's able to take in a lot of the earlier writings amongst the Sufi masters, amongst the Hadith scholars, and integrate them into a very masterful kind of structure in this book. In particularly, he uses Al-Harith al-Muhasibi's Ri'aya fi Huquqillah, who has a very important section on humility and pride in his book. And of course, the Kitab Al-Khumul by Ibn Abi Dunya, which is a beautiful text of hadiths that deal with obscurity, cultivating lowliness and humility. The one book that Imam al-Ghazali does not use is a tiny little text. It's called Kitab Dham Kibr al-Ulama by As-Sulami. And Ghazali doesn't indicate that he's used that text. Here's a tiny little treatise that deals with a theme that actually runs throughout the Ihya, which is that the scholars themselves, the religious scholars that is, they are the most in need often of the cultivation of all of the virtues. That's why Imam al-Ghazali wrote the book. He wrote it largely because he'd seen these problems in himself and in others and in the learned culture that he was a part of. So again, the theme of learning and how that relates to humility and the cultivation of pride is something that we're also going to be talking about in due course, inshallah. I'm going to sometimes draw on other texts too, like Ibn Atta'illah's Hikam, his famous aphorisms. There are some very wonderful sayings in there on humility and what the nature of humility is, actually, what the real measure of humble actions, entails, and other sayings within the tradition, amongst the philosophers, amongst the Sufis, and perhaps even some real life examples too in terms of contemporary times. Let me begin by drawing on a couple of verses from the Quran that Imam al-Ghazali himself in this book deals with. So he begins with, of course, as is customary in the Ihya, he begins with the Quran, then he goes to the Hadith, then he goes to sayings of the companions, and then he deals with the theory of, in this case, pride, and then sayings that relate to that, the theory of humility, sayings that relate to that. And then by the end of the book, he introduces a different factor, something that I haven't mentioned yet on purpose. But when you've seen pride and humility for what they actually are, he then takes you to another kind of negative quality and says that actually the root of pride is elsewhere. It's not where we think it is. But first, we need to have a very clear definition of what pride actually is and what humility actually is. And that's what he does. That's largely, the task that he sets out for himself in this book is laying out what each of these things entail and what they really are. Because sometimes you think you do something and you think you are being proud, when it might not actually be pride. It might be something else. Sometimes you have to be proud too, right? التكبر عند المتكبرين تواضع, for example, or ibadah, as the saying goes, right? Pride in front of the people who are proud, that's actually worship. That's you get a reward for putting somebody else in their place, right? So again, one has to keep their ego in check because you never know if there's a personal vendetta that's involved there too. And Imam al-Ghazali, again, in this book, deals with all of these things. He deals also with the nature of pride and the different kinds of pride. Why are people proud? So we're gonna get there eventually. But let me just quote a couple of verses from the Quran to begin with, some of the ones that he cites, and then we can move on from there. So one of the verses he cites is the one that I mentioned earlier. Truly, he loves not the prideful. إنه لا يحب المستكبرين. Okay. Then truly those who are too prideful to worship me, Allah says, shall enter hell debased. إن الذين يستكبرون عن عبادتي سيدخلون جهنم داخرين. Another verse that comes up often in discussions on pride is this one here. How evil is the abode of the proud. فَبِئْسَ مَثْوَى الْمُتَكَبِّرِينَ. So again, Allah Ta'ala makes it very clear in the Quran that pride, it's something extremely negative, and we must avoid it at all costs. As human beings, it's extremely destructive in ourselves. Now, let's look at some of the hadiths that Imam Ghazali will also bring in. And on many discussions on pride, these hadiths that I'm going to read for you, they often come up. So perhaps the most famous one is the Messenger of God bless him and grant him peace, has said, he in whose heart there is the weight of a mustard seed of pride shall not enter the garden. And the person in whose heart there is the weight of a mustard seed of faith shall not enter the fire. Very famous saying. Abu Hurairah, God be pleased with him, said, the Messenger of God, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, said that Allah Ta'ala says, grandeur is my robe and magnificence my covering. Whoever contends with me for either of them, I shall cast him into the fire and would not care. Right? Al-'azmatu ridai, al-kibriya'u ridai wal-'azmatu izari, faman naza'ani fihima qasamtuhu. And then another version, qasamtuhu wala ubali. I shall cast him. In this version, I shall cast him into the fire. And the one that I read, I shall break him, and I don't care. So don't compete with God in the qualities that are His. And this is a key insight about pride. Pride is only appropriate for God because He has something to be proud about. Now, we normally, again, going back to the earlier idea that I instilled in your minds about what pride is, we normally associate it with something negative, but it doesn't have to be. Of course, one of the divine names is God is Al-Mutakabbir, right? The proud. And He's not proud because He thinks He's better than everybody, right? That's a very human understanding of pride, which we'll see. It requires a kind of measuring up and then an assessment of yourself and others. But Allah Ta'ala is Al-Kabir Al-Muta'al. He's the great and the exalted, the transcendent. Of course, He should be proud. The word for pride in Arabic, takabbur, it comes from the word that means to be great. We say Allahu Akbar, right? To be great, to be exalted. So of course, Allah is like a king. It is the king sitting on a throne. The king on the throne is very exalted, and Allah Ta'ala, of course, being that king, does not like for anyone else to try to contend with Him in His kingship, because we don't have a right to that. So a lot of it has to do with the rights of God and the rights of the servant. Right? We cannot claim to have a quality that belongs just to God. So all that we could ever do is have the opposite of that quality that belongs just to God. For example, if God is the proud, our human response in relationship with Him means that we should cultivate humility. We should cultivate the opposite of being proud, of course. Um, there are a number of other very, very wonderful sayings here I'd like to share with you. Here's another one. The Prophet ﷺ said that the miserly, the arrogant, and those with an evil acquired disposition or an ugly acquired disposition shall not enter the garden. Okay, now here's another one that I particularly love. The Prophet, God bless him and grant him peace, said, "Vile is the servant who is arrogant and transgresses, forgetting the compeller, Al-Jabbar, the most exalted. Vile is the servant who is arrogant and ostentatious, forgetting the great, the transcendent. Vile is the servant who is heedless, negligent, and inattentive, yet forgets the grave and the decaying of his own body. Vile is the servant who is insolent and oppressive, yet forgets the beginning and the end." So here, one of the things that stands out in that saying of the Prophet is that a person who's got a true measure of the nature of things recognizes that he's going into his grave, recognizes this body will decay, this very thing that he loves so much. Usually, pride could be, it's either because of internal qualities or external qualities. In this case, let's say a person admires their beauty. Well, that beauty is going to go away very quickly once the body no longer is here, right? It'll decay. Ghazali gives many wonderful examples of the nature of pride over one's bodily form, explaining that, time, for example, it does everybody in. No matter how beautiful a person looks when they're younger, as they get older, they just, it just all falls away. And when they're dead, it for certainly all falls away. And nobody would like to be near their corpse, for example. Or he gives other everyday examples. For example, the person who they think they're so great, but they have to go to the washroom once or twice a day. So there's nothing so great about them in that state. And all of this, of course, is to awaken within us the understanding that we actually are nothing. And a person who recognizes their nothingness cannot exalt themselves because there's nothing left to exalt. That's the goal, really, of the spiritual life. The exaltation of something that's not there is precisely where the illusion lies. So the goal is to think away and to act away from this thing that keeps putting itself up there as unique and special and distinctive and good and nice, namely the ego, the nafs, and to break it completely once and for all. When that can happen, of course, then true humility comes about, because it's equivalent to leveling all the idols. Once all the idols are gone, there's just a barren ground that is left. Now, let me now move into some of the ways in which Al-Ghazali explains what humility is. So right now we just said something about just about some of the textual supports for why pride is considered a negative thing, relating it back to the divine name Al-Mutakabbir. And we'll see in a moment how humility and pride kind of relate to one another on a much deeper fundamental level. But let's look at some of the hadiths and sayings of the companions here. Okay. There's one here. Where did it go? This is one of my favorite ones. Okay. The Prophet, God bless him and grant him peace, said, "My Lord gave me to choose between two things, that I either be a servant and a messenger, or a king and a prophet. I did not know which one to choose. My dear friend from among the angels was Gabriel. I raised my head to him, and he said, 'Be humble before your Lord.' Thus I said, 'A servant and a messenger.'" He chose to be a servant and a messenger. the Prophet revealed to Moses, God revealed to Moses, excuse me, God revealed to Moses, I only accept the prayer of the one who is humble before my magnificence, who does not magnify himself in front of my creatures, whose heart is attached to the fear of me, who spends his days in the remembrance of me, and who restrains himself from his passions for my sake. The Prophet, God bless him and grant him peace, said, generosity is reverence, nobility is humility, and certainty is self-sufficiency. Someone said, it has reached me that the Prophet, God bless him and grant him peace, said, when God guides a servant to Islam, beautifies his form, places him in a position which is not dishonorable for him, and alongside this provides him with humility, that is the choicest of God's gifts. The Prophet, God bless him and grant him peace, said, there are four things that God gives only to those whom he loves. Silence, which is the beginning of worship, trusting God, humility, and renunciation of the world. Ibn Abbas said that the Messenger of God, والسلام, said, if a servant is humble, God shall elevate him to the seventh heaven. So the word for humility in Arabic, and the one that's coming up here in the text, it's tawadur, which comes from a root that has to do with going down. Wada'a means to put something down. It's the verb in Arabic that, like to place a book down, for example, wada'a. So tawadur has to do with taking your whole self and putting it down. Now you can see why for the ancient Greeks this would be a problem, right? Because it puts the person in a much lower state, and that means others are above that person. But here, we're dealing with sacred revelation. We're dealing with a tradition in which human beings are interacting with God. If God is up, we necessarily are down, and we fail to understand what we are when we try to contend with God for those of his qualities. So we have to recognize what it is that we're all about. Now, paradoxically, if we ever want to become exalted, we must put ourselves down. So you don't go up by putting yourself up. You only go up by putting yourself down. Likewise, if you put yourself up, God will put you down. And there's, again, many sayings and hadiths that relate to this, right? Right? Whoever exalts himself before God, God will lower him. But whoever lowers himself before God, God will raise him. So the real question that comes up then is, what makes humility so loathsome in the eyes of many? Why is it that some people don't like humility, for example? Whereas it seems like everybody tends to not like pride, at least on one level. It kind of looks ugly. In some individuals, we look and we say, oh, that's a kind of meek behavior. We're kind of turned down by that. When that happens, usually it's because the person, number one, they may not understand what they're seeing. You might see someone like Mother Teresa, for example, such a wonderful, humble woman, and think to yourself, oh no, she was just, just poor and with the destitute all the time. What's so good about that? So we may have the wrong opinion of what makes an exalted person an exalted person. Or we may be seeing qualities that exude something of humility, but which may not actually be based and rooted in actual humility. It might be like a kind of like pretension, or what we call in contemporary parlance, fronting. We might be fronting, right? And then that turns off a lot of people too. A kind of, false religiosity, false humility. And so, but if we can kind of see what humility actually looks like, Imam Ghazali and many other authors, of course, in the tradition, many of these great Sufi masters, they say that it has very little to do with actually physically putting yourself down, right? It's not a physical quality we're talking about, right? There's so many stories about these Sufis who, in their training, they put themselves down thinking that they're, being humbled, and their master tells them, look, you still have the same nasty heart that you had before, right? It's still stained with the dross of duality, and you're just, you haven't actually actualized humility. So what is an actual humble kind of position? And what does it look like? What do the behaviors of somebody who's actually humble, how do we come to discern what they are all about? One of the ways that you can discern where humility is not is if you have to think about it. See if you're overthinking an action. If you overthinking, am I being humble? Am I not being humble? Is this the right thing? Is not? That means it's not second nature to you, which means because there's a kind of deliberation involved, there's an ego involved, there's an other involved, there's a self that is contemplating about itself, and that's precisely where the problem lies. So to cut right to the chase, that is what needs to go. That self-calculation and that ability to look at oneself. Of course, introspection is key. But later on, I mean, actualized humility, there is nothing left to debase and to lower so that you can see yourself as having to, debase it. And that's precisely what Ibn Atta'illah has in mind in one of his hikams, which I want to read to you. He says, من أثبت لنفسه تواضعا فهو المتكبر حقا إذ ليس التواضع إلا عن رفعة فمتى أثبت لنفسه رفعة فأنت فمتى أثبت لنفسك رفعة فأنت المتكبر حقا. Let me read that again. من أثبت لنفسه تواضعا فهو المتكبر حقا إذ ليس تواضع إلا عن رفعة فمتى أثبت لنفسك رفعة فأنت المتكبر حقا. So to translate this loosely, he says, whoever affirms humility for himself, that person who does that, in reality, he is actually proud because real humility is not when you are looking at yourself from up above down. Oh, I'm humble now. Rather, it's when you affirm for yourself a station and you look down at yourself, that's actually the opposite of humility. That's actually pride. So in other words, you cannot look at yourself and try to debase it, because if you're doing that, there's that other relationship, the subject-object dichotomy that still is there. That's where all the distance comes from. And when that happens, for sure, there will be pride. And even if it's pretending to look like humility, it's not actually humility, especially if it's contrived and forced. Look at this one, another one from Ibn Atta'illah. He says, ليس المتواضع الذي إذا تواضع رأى أنه فوق ما صنع ولكن المتواضع الذي إذا تواضع رأى أنه دون ما صنع. He says that the real humble person is not the one who when he acts humble, thinks that he's above what he's done, because then again, he still sees himself as above some action, whether it's his nafs or anything else. But rather, the humble person is the one who sees that he is below what he does. So there's nothing that's going to obstruct him from his humility other than the fact that he affirms for himself a kind of position and then ensures that humble action that he's committing, that somehow now because of that he's like above what he's doing. He's like, in a sense, it's like a gift that he's presenting to God. Such a great thing that he's doing. And he's saying it's the opposite here. The opposite is that the truly humble person, no matter what he does, he's always in a state of brokenness before God. He always recognizes that he doesn't have anything. And he says, oh Allah, all these things that I've done, all of these, even these beautiful gifts that you've given to me, look at how much I've fallen short in your eyes with respect to them. Well, another one of my the hikams that I love of Ibn Atta'illah is the one where he says, if you want to open up the door of fear, that is your fear for God, he says, look at what comes from you to him. Look at how many times you fall short. But if you want to open up the door of hope, look at what comes from him to you. So in other words, you should always be in a state of brokenness before the divine. You should always understand that Nothing that comes from you is of any great merit, especially when your own ego is trapped up in it. And even when it's a gift and it's at the highest level, you can always see that there's some kind of deficiency in it with respect to the perfection of God. Every action that we perform vis-a-vis the divine perfection will always fall short of the divine perfection. From that perspective, we should always be making istighfar, recognizing that we are never worthy to be in the company of God. That's why the Prophet so famously said that he makes istighfar 70 times in a day, right? Well, if he's making istighfar 70 times in a day, what about the rest of us? Now, one more from Ibn Ata'illah. He says here, التواضع الحقيقي هو ما كان ناشئا عن شهود عظمته وتجلى صفته. That true humility, it's what comes, it's what comes from witnessing God's exaltedness and when His qualities are disclosed to you. That's when true humility comes about. True humility, in other words, comes about when you witness God's greatness and you recognize that the greatness of the divine Son is, it kind of completely takes in anything under it, and that is what is the source of its illumination. We are at best but shadows with respect to the divine Son. So instead of looking at how great a thing is that we've done, we should always look at the fact of that, where it comes from, number one, and number two, the fact that God is so exalted. You know, قاهر فوق عباده, he's exalted above all of his servants. He's, you know, completely overpowering them all the time. That kind of engenders within us, just like a lowly servant, literally like a king is above us. We see ourselves as nothing, and that's that kind of breaking of the ego is what is required, and that comes about through recognizing the jalala and the alama of God, the greatness, the exaltedness of the divine presence. And that's why, of course, when we pray, right, we say Allahu Akbar, which we're telling ourselves, of course, you know, that God is the greatest or God is greater. But we also literally in the beginning of the salah, what do? Allahu Akbar. We throw the entire world behind us, and now we're in the divine presence. But there's something else there. There's a little secret there too that many of the Sufi authors talk about. We're not just throwing the world behind us, we're throwing our nafs behind us too. Wallahu Akbar, God is greater than my nafs, than anything that I can conceive, my concerns, which all of which come back to egocentric, deficiencies in ourselves and internal chatter. Allahu Akbar, all of it gone. Now you're in the divine presence, and it's not you who's in the divine presence, right? That's the beauty of it. That's another sirr and a secret that comes about in some of these Sufi authors, as you've seen. For example, Maulana, in that famous story of this man who prays and prays and prays, and he has a wonderful explanation of who it is that actually did the prayer, right? It wasn't the man that prayed, it was God who prayed to himself in the mirror of this servant's nothingness. Now, let me continue on with some more technical discussions about pride, because it'll set up the treatment for something else that I want to say a little bit later on. If the word for pride is kibr and takabbur, as we've seen, which comes from this word to be great, there are many other terms that we're not going to get into here, because they're all kind of like, inflections on pride. There's for example isti'dham, right? There's the quality of of having thinking that you're so great. So like actually just having like just a thought about yourself being this great, that can also be a kind of, they're all different kinds of forms of pride. You can have you can be one of the jabbarin, you can be one of these people who are arrogant and exalted. That's another kind of tajabbur, they call it, right? There's so many other istinkaf, when you're looking down at somebody, kind of like, looking down, almost like deriding them. But all of those qualities that we can give in Arabic, there's so many different terms for these kinds of practices. They all go back to this one word that we call in English pride. And the distinction that Imam Ghazali raises is he says that pride in and of itself, it first of all comes from the internal part of a person. Comes it's deeply rooted inside their hearts. So it's an internal quality, and it's a disposition then, right? And now that disposition, that internal quality inside the individual, uh, it is then the basis of actions that come out of it, which manifest in the world, and we call that pride. So here he makes a distinction between pride in itself, right, and then of course pride, takabbur, what he would call kind of like being proud or acting proudly. So pride in itself and acting proudly. Let me read for you the definition, because it's a very powerful definition, and it's really one of the most important texts in the tradition that deals with this. Okay, it's slightly long, but I think it's important because of something that he says, that he raises, that will kind of tie into the things we want to speak about. He says that pride divides into an inward aspect and an outward aspect. So we said that. The inward aspect is a disposition in the soul, while the outward aspect consists of actions that proceed from the limbs. The name pride, kibr, is more appropriate for the inner disposition. As for proud actions, they are simply the fruits of this disposition. The proud disposition necessitates actions, which is why it is called being proud, takabbur, when it appears on the limbs, and pride in itself when it does not appear. So here you have pride in itself and then acting proudly. Thus, the root of pride is a disposition in the soul, namely the repose and reliance upon considering oneself to be above the object of pride. Now, what he means there is that when you have a kind of sense of, greatness in yourself, it always is because of an object that's outside of you. So you don't just wake up and just think that you're so great. That's another thing. We'll see later what that is. Right? So to be proud, there has to be somebody else. That's key. And then there has to be a kind of evaluation. You have to measure out, you have to kind of size up that person, and then you have to affirm yourself as better than them. Like a perfect example, of course, from the Quran is Iblis, right? He tells God, he says, Ana khairun minhu, about Adam, right? He tells God, I am better than him. Why? And then he explains why. He explains what his reasoning is. He says, because you created him from clay, you created me from fire. Fire is better than clay, therefore I'm better than him. That's a perfect application of what pride is. That's why they say, "Awwalu man qasa shaitan." The first person to reason by analogy was the devil. So look how Ghazali explains this very thing. He says, okay, pride entails that a person assigns a rank for himself. So you already think there's something good about yourself, and then a rank for someone else. So you put yourself somewhere, you put that other person somewhere, and they're lower than you. And then you see your own rank to be above the rank of that person. It is in accordance with these three beliefs that a proud disposition comes about in a person. And then so now that that's inside of you and you start to act, then your behavior starts to show. So when you kind of like turn somebody away that's because you think you're better than them. There are so many qualities and so many examples like this. I don't need to get into them, but it's pretty self-explanatory. When you act in a proud way towards somebody, there is that estimation in yourself that this person's below you. Now, it gets very complicated, of course, because there are instances in which you know that you're actually below that person, but you'll still act proud just to kind of put them in their place. Sometimes there can be many motivations for that. Imam al-Ghazali, of course, in his book, he gets into all of these examples, explaining, where that kind of action comes from, right? If it's just to get back at the person for a perceived previous wrong, right? It's not necessarily proud. It's not necessarily pride, excuse me. Pride, it's a very specific thing, right? It's when you see yourself as better and you act on that. Now, you might see somebody as on equal footing, and you still might try to one up them, right? That could qualify for kind of pride too. right? But generally, the definition of pride, as we've seen, it's when that other is made to be lower than you. Now, why is that wrong? Well, it's wrong for the fundamental reason that nobody's better than anybody else, right? That's the fundamental reason why that kind of assessment, where you think you're better than somebody and from which comes a quality of pride in your heart, and then through which the actions manifest on your limbs called proud actions, the reason that can never and should never be the case is because there's no instance in which we can ever know that we're better than somebody else. How do we know that? How can we know that? There's no, unless if we're in heaven and they're not in heaven and we're looking from paradise, right? Because to be in a better situation than somebody, it has nothing to do with, that you're better off than them, let's say economically, or that you're more intelligent than them, or more beautiful than them, or have a better lineage than them, or more property, or more friends, or any of the examples that these Sufi authors get into. None of that is a measure for your being better than somebody. That just means you have certain blessings perhaps that the other person does not have. Doesn't mean you're better though. Now, when you get to the question of worship, because that's the real measure for all of this, a person's closeness to God should determine whether they are so-called better than somebody else. And that's only from God's assessment, not from ours. From our assessment, we always see ourselves, like we saw Ibn Atta'illah say, as necessarily below the things that we're doing. And so we can never even give ourselves any credit or a pat on the back, so to speak, spiritually speaking, congratulating ourselves, because it doesn't work that way. If we want to know what our status with God is, we should look at where God is in our lives. Are we remembering Allah Ta'ala? Is his mention on our tongues and in our hearts? If we're so occupied with the divine beloved and we're completely immersed in the divine beloved, fana when you go, and baqa is when he comes. If it's like that, then there's no self to look at to say that I'm better than somebody else, and I'm, all you do is you just see yourself in the light of the divine. And when you have that momentary vision because of the human state that you are doing something, you recognize, number one, that it's a gift, and number two, that because it's coming through this fallen receptacle, there will always be a kind of coloration, and it'll always be some kind of a tint to it that's going to negatively affect it and color it. So we never give, in other words, ourselves a benefit of the doubt. Now, a humble person, they do the opposite of what a proud person does, because they give others the benefit of the doubt. Now, think about every instance in which you have had a narrative about somebody, and you're so sure that they did this, and they said this because of this, and they did that because of this. And sometimes, most of the time, it's just speculation. We actually don't really have good reasons often to think negatively of others based on actions that they've seen, or maybe perceived wrongs that may have occurred to us from them. But in order for us to assess them correctly, we have to have all of these positions, all of these ideas in our minds about them. They have to be 100% correct. And if a single one of them is off, our narrative about that person and their actions falls, it fails, it dies, it's done. But that's precisely the problem, because what kind of arrogance is it on our parts to be able to insist that somebody else must conform to our own narrative about them in every step of the way, so that then we can understand them better, when it could have been the case that it's something that we don't understand. And that's what humility entails. Humility entails where you say, La adri, I really don't know why this person did that thing. I have reasons, maybe these are the correct reasons, I don't know, but I can't insist, because we just don't know. That's why God is the best judge of human beings. No human being can judge another human being, because we don't know what's in people's hearts. Even if they say they do things the way they do them and the reason they do them, on one fundamental level, only Allah Ta'ala really knows what's going on, right? He's the one, as he says in the Quran, who dwells between a human being and their heart. Right? He's the one who is always there. He's completely aware. We don't have that awareness. So again, our own ignorance of ourselves, of events, let alone others, should engender in us greater sense of humility, greater sense of nothingness. Now, something does need to be said about what I referred to earlier as loathful forms of humility. And again, Imam al-Ghazali, in the aforementioned book, gets into all the different kinds of styles of humility and what counts for humility and what does not count. And he says that there are two extremes, where one extreme you basically debase yourself completely just to make a point to yourself that you're humble, but there's so much of you involved that it's no longer humility. It's quite the opposite. It's actually arrogance. And another one is that where you're just not showing any actions of humility at all in any way, that it's not affecting you because you're not actually doing the actions that should have an effect upon your soul. So for example, in prayer, when you pray, you're in a beautiful humble state before God. You're exalted, your head is down, and that's divinely instituted. So we know that every action that has come about uh, through in the Quran, in the teachings of the Prophet, those are things that are not going to debase us. So you can do those as much as you like, and you'll always be on the right side of humility. But let's say you wanna, you want to break something in your ego, and you want to tell somebody who you're having a discussion with, and you want to praise them for a point that they made. And Imam Ghazali again explains this. He gets into this. Now you want to exalt the person, and you want to you want to basically break your own egotistical desire to always be correct. So you're having a debate with somebody, they make the correct points, you catch yourself and say, I'm not going to argue for a false point here because that's just my nafs. This person's correct, and you say thank you very much, and then you move on. That's a good thing. But now in this case, you overpraise them. You say, oh, thank you, what a beautiful point, this was wonderful, how great. So now you've broken your nafs, but then you keep going. You're the smartest guy, and you start, and you go home and you make a Wikipedia page about them and how smart they are, and then you really just overthought this, right? And so that kind of extreme is never a good thing. Imam Ghazali gives other examples, like like you wanna be humble before your guests. So the guests come in, you start taking off their shoes and wiping their feet. You're debasing yourself, and that's definitely not humility. And this is in accordance with the prophetic saying. Prophet ﷺ said, "Al al mu'min la yudhillu nafsahu." Right? The believer does not belittle himself, does not bring himself down. So don't think that belittling yourself is anything to do with humility, right? The human being is exalted. They're created the image of God. They should always have a very dignified manner of comportment and behavior. And so you should not put yourself down. The believer does not debase himself. Now, of course, you do need to be able to acknowledge the truth when it's in front of you, and if your ego has a problem with that, you have to be able to break it. But if you've done it in a truthful way, in accordance with the teachings that have come down to us in our own tradition, then it's very easy for you to place yourself properly along that continuum, which is why it's so important to follow the tradition, to have the ta'alluq and connection with the Sufi masters and the great sages of Islam and Sufism, because they can really show us how to be. That's why we have suhbats, right, with our teachers, because by being with them, you see what actual humility is, right? Very little of it has to do with this person sitting there and saying bad things about themselves. It's never like that, right? The most humble person in the room is not the one who stands up and says, I'm nothing, I'm garbage, and they start, right? They're humble because they're not there. They're only there as a conduit, for like windows for the divine sun to enter into darkness of the room. They're there as conduits for the presence of the divine in the world. That's the truly humble person. And that kind of humility, it exudes norms, all of the norms, a complete kind of actualization of the human state vis-a-vis the image in which it was created, an image of the divine. Now, if this is what humility entails, and kind of the extremes of it, and then of course pride, these are it has, as we've seen, this internal quality and this outward action, and the reasons we've seen for why people are proud, and so on and so forth. What is this other mystery quality that I've brought up here? Because I mentioned it, but I kind of didn't say anything about it. And I do that largely because in the book of Imam Ghazali, he himself puts it off till way later. So that's the first part. But he announces what that quality is in the title of the book. And this is the term in Arabic, it's urjub. Urjub. which we translate into English as self-admiration. Now, of course, if anyone familiar with Arabic, you would see that the word ujub, it comes from the word like ajaba, right? Ajib, to be amazed. So somebody who has ujub, they are amazed with themselves, right? So it's very not humble, right? It's the opposite of humility. Now, what might surprise some people is that Imam al-Ghazali says, like many others in the tradition, that self-admiration is actually even worse than pride. And the reason is because whereas pride, kibr and takabbur, it requires another an assessment, as we saw, and then acting in accordance with that assessment. Self-admiration does not require anybody else to be around or in the picture. It has to do with just yourself. And so it's the basis of all of this egotistical behavior that can then manifest into pride and so on and so forth. So it's the root actually of all of them. Now, one example that he gives, for example, he says you could be like alone, in a room on a desert island, whatever the case may be, and just think that you're good. There's some qualities of perfection that you see in yourself, maybe some intelligence, whatever the case may be, some skills, some employment, some wealth, some control in the world, some influence, something. Or it might not be anything like that. It might be something very small that you do. You might be a great potter, or you might be able to cook dinner well, and you might then just admire yourself for it. And those are all considered to be ujub. And so how do you overcome ujub? Well, it's number one, the easy way is to be amazed, yes, because everything is a blessing. Everything is amazing. Everything is a miracle. But to see where the miracle comes from, it comes from the divine side, not from our side. The very fact that we're here right now, that is a miracle in itself. The fact that God does not take us to task for all the negative things that we do, the things that only He knows about that occur to us in our hearts and our minds and our actions. Yet He continuously puts veils over other people's eyes, uh, covering up our negative qualities. That itself should cause us to be amazed with Him, not with us. Right? You don't get amazed with God for covering up. You don't get amazed with yourself, excuse me, when God covers up your faults. Right? That's called delusion. When you start thinking that God covers up your faults, maybe because it's something good that you did. He loves me so much that He lets me sin, and no one else can see it. You start praising yourself. So this is really giving yourself the absolute benefit of the doubt. But it's also to fail to see the nature of things in their proper proportions, and to understand that that kind of thinking, it might work for a year or 2 or 3 years, or maybe even 30 years, but eventually it'll catch up with you. And one of the things that self-admiration is related to often, it's complacency. Complacency, where you think that you're just fine, right? Like you don't you just don't, nothing bad is going to happen to you from the divine side, because of some qualities of perfection that you have, because you're actually that good. You might also have like a lot of trust in God, but that's not the right way to operate, right? And this is called aman, right? When you have too much aman, but not in the right way, right? Where you have you feel safe because of your own self, not because of the divine self. And so you have to be very much on guard for the makr of Allah, or the deception of the divine deception, when that happens, when you feel too much aman, which of course is what Allah says in the Quran, right? That none feel safe, right, from the makr of Allah, except the people who are really in trouble, right? People who are deeply deluded and sinful in their behavior and in their nature. So if self-admiration is that thing that is the basis for our pride, then naturally, if we get rid of self-admiration, we can get rid of the pride, and then the humility will come about. That's clear, right? Because that's just the logical order of the way things work. But how difficult is it to cultivate humility in a world where perhaps even arrogance is kept on check, but self-admiration is really not? Think of social media culture. We live in a world that thrives largely off of the cult of the self. Literally, when we're taking pictures of ourselves and posting them everywhere about the meals that we eat and all that kind of stuff, it may not necessarily be a person's self-admiration. Everyone has different reasons for doing the things that they're doing, but there are definitely the majority of instances in which that kind of behavior comes about. It proceeds from a place where there's a kind of evaluation of one's own significance, and then the need to kind of blast that out there in the world. So already the world that we live in, it doesn't teach us to be humble, right? It teaches us to admire ourselves and to admire others, yes, but especially to admire ourselves. And so it's a great difficulty in the lives that we live to be able to break that negative sense of, and the stranglehold of the dunya on ourselves, and to break free from it and to cultivate humility, especially in a world where humility is not considered a positive quality, as I mentioned. But you'll notice that even people who are not necessarily religious, they'll remark that they like to be around Sufis, even if they don't even believe in God. There's a quality of them that they like, and that's what they like in them. It's the humility. It's the fact that they stand out from the rest of the people that these individuals interact with, because they're not about themselves. They're not out there to get a point in somebody's eyes, or to exalt themselves, and or get offended when somebody hurts their supposed feelings or something like this. None of that matters to them. So they're kind of like, they're just there, and the people around them, they can sense that everyone's fitra, they're drawn towards individuals who do not see themselves. That's natural. You see this, for example, in mothers, and mothers are, they've always been known for their total selflessness, right, and their self-sacrifice, and people admire that, and it's hard to understand. It's hard to really see how somebody can be so selfless, but we all admire it. And from the Sufi perspective, it makes total sense, because it's a natural extension of what the spiritual life is really all about. Or babies, for example, another very good example of individuals who don't self-admire. They don't see a self, number one, to admire themselves. And it's self-admiration, by the way, with a small s, not with the capital S. The capital S self-admiration is the best thing you could do for yourself. That's when you admire God, the true self. So if you look at babies, right, the reason we love them so much is because they're humble, they don't have an ego, and they really exude existentially the entire state of what it means to be realized. Humble individuals living in the divine presence and in the present moment at all times. Yet the thing that they lack, of course, is having lived a long life and gone through the cycle of learning and knowledge. So for that, you go to elders. That's why many of the great masters, traditionally they've been older people, because they've lived a life like everybody else has, and they've gone through the learning, and now they've actualized that state of infancy, but with the knowledge, and so a deeper, much deeper sense of awareness of what the true self and the nature of a spiritual life entails. Now, it's important for us, as many of the authors tell us, to understand that you may wish to be humble, but it's not going to come about by just thinking about it or by reading about it. This is where the practice comes in. And this is what I want to end on. How essential it is to, number one, of course, do the daily prayers, the fast in Ramadan, all of the fundamental pillars of Islam. That's kind of par for the course. But to also take things further and to recognize that our nafs always wants to have it always wants to shrink away from the responsibilities that God has given to it. So at the beginning, the nafs says, well, I'm going to do these 5 daily prayers, and I'll do these performances, and I'm good to go. I'm safe. But somebody who loves to be with God, this is this is not their attitude, right? They think to themselves, how can I have, what other opportunities can I have to be with the divine beloved? And the more that love increases, the more that shauq and yearning and it intensifies, the more their lives become filled with the remembrance of God and opportunities that lead to that. And why should it not be the case? The Prophet ﷺ said very famously, الدنيا وما فيها ملعونة إلا ذكر الله, right? That this world and everything in it is accursed except for the remembrance of Allah. So those who are constantly in the remembrance of God, they're the ones, as the Quran says, they're the ones who are the truly successful. They succeed because they've been able to break away from the barriers and prison of the self and the insistence that the self is significant, that it has all of these qualities that should be admired. And so the dhikr is the surest way to break that ignorance, that cycle and chain of ignorance that perpetually places us, into the dungeon of our own existence and keeps us there trapped. Once in a while we resurface, but then we'll pull right back down again. Come out, pull back right back down again. But the dhikr slowly, it chisels away at each chain, breaking it until we're free. And when we're free, finally, with the grace of Allah Ta'ala, and may we all attain that state, then after that, we can live a life where there's no longer a question of the need to lower the self, because there's no longer a self left to lower. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.